My name is Kennedy Mbeva, and I'm a research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. I'm delighted to present an overview of my paper, Green Pan-Africanism, Normative Power, and the Making of a Regional Sustainability Order, which will be published by Review of International Studies Journal. The paper examines the challenge of how governments have used or tried to use the trade regime to advance environmental governance. And I specifically look at the strategies of states that do not have much material power, ensure that they have been innovative or adopted innovative strategies to use the trade regime to address environmental issues. I develop my argument in four steps. The first is epistemological, where I examine the assumption that mainly major Western economies have used their trade agreements to advance environmental sustainability goals. Much of the literature is premised on that argument, where the explanation is that the US and the EU, using their dominant economic power or relative bargaining power that they draw from the huge market economies, have used them to uh, get their trading partners to adopt more stringent environmental sustainability goals. Well, that is true to the extent that these powers have conducted forum shopping where they use the trade regime to advance their preferred environmental policy goals. That is only part of a larger story. And the larger story that my article tells is that there are other states which are not as powerful, but they've been equally, if not more, ambitious in using their trade agreements to advance environmental policy goals. In this case, I've focused on Africa and I show how African countries have adopted innovative strategies in using their regional trade agreements to advance environmental policy goals in ways that sometimes are different and more innovative than the accounts in the literature. And I do so in three subsequent steps that I'll outline. The first is conceptual, where I use the concept of normative power to show that power can be expressed in other ways apart from material capabilities or hegemony. And in this case, because many African states are least developed countries or lower middle income countries, they do not have as much economic weight, at least in the global economy, as the Western counterparts. But that has not stopped them from using the trade agreements or the trade regime in general to advance environmental sustainability goals. And I developed the concept of green Pan-Africanism to show that it is a kind of normative power that African countries have used. Of course, they rely on Pan-Africanism as a guiding ideology for economic and political regional integration. But the green component shows that they've integrated environmental sustainability in these initiatives, which leads me to my next argument about the theory. So of course, I challenge the hegemonic change theory, which argues that the major hegemonic powers, in this case, the US especially, and also the EU, use their dominant power in the global economy to advance environmental sustainability goals. And this narrative, they're the normal entrepreneurs and their trading partners, which usually happen to be smaller economies, presented as being reluctant to connecting the two agendas, that is trade and environment. And so the US and the EU and other Western economies induce them to change their preferences by embracing environmental sustainability goals. Well, I challenge this narrative theoretically and argue that there are other ways that we can have change in international regimes. I rely on John Ruggie's notion of norm-governed change to argue that even though international trade agreements could change and they take different kinds of forms, there are times when the normative content, that is environmental sustainability, remains constant. And I use the example of Green Pan-Africanism to show that it is a form of norm-governed change where African countries have radically transformed their trade agreements in the last actually the last 4 decades, but they've maintained environmental sustainability as a core component of the initiatives. I now turn to the empirical part of the argument where I conduct a detailed case study of how African countries have advanced Green Pan-Africanism over the last 6 decades or so. I outlined 4 stages, 3 stages within which through which those countries have advance this idea. The first is agenda setting, where African countries were very active in the international debates on environment and sustainability, including in Rio in 1992, Stockholm in 1972, and other major and more recent global fora, as well as in regional domain, to make the argument that trade and environment go hand in hand. And so there's a need to ensure that the trade regime incorporates environmental sustainability at its core. The other aspect, or the second aspect of normal government change that I show, is that of institutionalization. And I show where, in establishing the regional economic communities in the 1980s and 1990s, African countries embedded environmental chapters, that's obligations to implement environmental commitments, in their regional economic communities, which are, of course, underpinned by preferential trade agreements. And these are very deep PTAs, and they show the kind of cooperation that African countries envisioned, where economic integration would go hand in hand with environmental sustainability. But of course, things change in international politics, and over the last several years, African countries have sought to rely on trade policy to transform their socioeconomic fortunes. And this includes having a common market across the continent. So they conclude the African Continental Free Trade Area agreement, which brings together 54 African countries. But surprisingly, the agreement did not include a chapter on environment, which had many people concerned that maybe African countries had regressed on that agenda. But they actually took a very different approach, where they developed guidelines that would advise and guide African member states that have adopted the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to integrate environmental and especially climate change policy considerations and commitments in their national plans that are meant to implement the AFCFTA. And what we see is a very kind of innovative environment, where Kenya, Namibia, and Cote d'Ivoire, for example, have used their national implementation strategies under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to connect trade policy with environmental policy and climate change policy. And if you look at Namibia's national implementation strategy, for example, it connects the agenda of green industrialization as a way to bridge trade and environmental policy. And Cote d'Ivoire's plan connects with the Paris Agreement, opening very creative ways to connect trade and climate policy that may suggest a way out of the gridlock that we see in the multilateral trade regime as regards the climate agenda. So I conclude the article by arguing that we should revisit the narrative that only a few Western economies lead the way in terms of having green trade agreements, and open avenues for considering how other countries might use different kinds of strategies to advance environmental sustainability through the trade regime. I conclude by pointing to opportunities for future research, where scholars could examine in more detail whether we could see other regions adopting different or similar strategies to connect the trade and environment, and especially the climate change agenda. There's also a lot of material that has yet been tapped, which could open opportunities for very detailed case study of very consequential PTAs, and for scholars to show how, for example, the environment and climate agenda gets taken on board or gets discarded. And that could open up new ideas for connecting the trade and climate change agenda. Hope you enjoy reading the article. Thank you.